Did you know that some people in China feel more free than we do in the West? That sounds crazy, right? But stick with me. This will blow your mind. We just had an incredible conversation with Peter Alexander, who spent the better part of 30 years living, working, and building a business in Shanghai. He shared a perspective on freedom that completely flips the Western narrative on its head. In this episode, we're diving into what freedom really means, how it's defined differently in China versus the West, and why this contrast might reveal more about our own freedoms than we realize. Get ready to challenge what you think you know, and let's get started. This episode is brought to you by Covered.io, an options trading tool that we use to generate extra income to free up time so we can pursue projects like this podcast. This is The Covered Call, the podcast where we explore the journey towards true freedom. In each episode, we bring on guests that have charted their own course towards more freedom, more contentment, and more impact in their lives. Welcome to yet another fascinating episode of the Covered Call podcast. Today here, again, Jason, my co-host, my name is Lovis, and of course, our honored guest, Peter Alexander, joining us live from Shanghai, which is in China. Peter was born in the US, but he has spent the better part of the last 3 decades living and working in Shanghai. And since Jason just recently returned from a trip to China and was, I quote, blown away by visiting this parallel universe, we wanted to take this opportunity while the impressions are still fresh. And Peter and Jason actually met up in person in Shanghai as well. And we wanted to take this opportunity to connect and discuss freedom and China and get some of the story of Peter's life and what he's doing there in the first place, and compare and contrast a little bit of about our personal backgrounds, East meets West, and the likes. So welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for taking the time.
I really appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to having a discussion with you guys. It's always fun when you throw the word freedom in China into this first sentence. So looking forward to seeing where this goes and getting to whatever questions you guys have.
Yeah, Peter, when we met in Shanghai, it was really fun, and I had a really good time. I can't wait for the next one. But looking forward to just continuing on that conversation here in the meantime, right? So for us with the podcast, we're always looking to talk to people that have gone off the beaten track a little bit. And in your case, I would say it was more than a little bit, right? Not many people can say that, hey, I live in China, I'm from the West, I speak Chinese as good as a local. So how maybe just in broad terms, right? What got you to take that kind of a step, right? It must have been so unconventional, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, unconventional, I think, is probably one of the more diplomatic words that was used. Look, the very simple answer to the question of why did I move to China was, number one, it's good to be young, dumb. You don't really have any liabilities, right? I was 25. There was no mortgage or kids or any of that sort of thing. And quite frankly, I hated my job. So I was working in Wall Street in what's now called a family office. It wasn't called a family office back in the 90s, early 90s. And I was an emerging market analyst. Again, that wasn't really a term back in the early 90s. And was just really fortunate that it just coincided with China essentially coming out for the first time as an investment destination. And this was in 92 and 93. There was a ton of excitement and fervor over China's opening up and what have you. So for me, I reached a point in my career where I was supposed to go get my MBA. And if I wanted to, move up, in the food chain, as it were. And I didn't believe that, it was worth the time, the money. So I was trying to figure out something that would potentially add value to the commodity that is labor. And I thought, you know what? Let me learn Mandarin Chinese. So I went up to the new school in Manhattan. I found a teacher there and said, "Hey, look, I'll pay you money if you just give me private lessons." We did that for a couple of years. Again, at that time, I was 23, 24, having a good time in New York. And the long and the short of it was he finally said to me, "Hey, are you serious about this? Because if you are, there's actually opportunities to go to China and teach English." And I jumped at it. I again hated my job. The joke about, what do you want to be when you grow up? Just as important, I found out, was what don't you want to be? And I certainly did not want to be, some cog in the wheel of a large financial firm. So signed on for a 1.5-year contract to come teach English in Shanghai. Figured I would do that for a bit and then go back to, uh, the U.S. and figure things out from there. And it really, it's not overstating the fact that when I got here, it clicked. I just fell in love with the place, explored the city. I just did everything and just dove in head first. And with a matter of, I don't know, a month or two, just knew that this was where I was supposed to be. And then, what's the joke, right? What happens when you're making plans? Life happens. So ended up, getting a real job, got fired for the first time during the Asian financial crisis, got married, started a family, the whole thing. And, next thing you know, it's been the better part of 30 years, which is really odd because I have officially been in my entire life more in China than I have in the United States. So as a benchmark, it's one of those challenges to really wrap your head around. So that's sort of the quick and dirty version of it.
That's really cool. Thank you for the little bit of background. Yeah, so actually, you pointed this out already. So you ended up getting your MBA in Shanghai, right? On your LinkedIn, it said Rutgers, and I assumed that you did that and then somehow transitioned to Shanghai. But how did that come about?
So I don't know, was it 2001 or 2002, something like that. Again, maybe it's just generational. That whole like I need an MBA type of thing still was clattering around in my brain. And Rutgers happened to do a joint venture with the Communications University, Jiaotong Daxue, here in Shanghai. And it was a, every month, 2 evenings, 4 weekend kind of thing. And I just remember saying to them, I don't want an EMBA. I want like a proper MBA. And they were like, no, then this is what it is. So yeah, so, went off and did that here in Shanghai for, I don't know, it was 2.5 years or something over weekends and whatnot. Yeah, I look back on it and think, okay, probably not worth the time and the money, but that's where Rutgers slots into the sort of CV, if you will.
Did anybody from actual mainland US join that program? Was it exclusively for people like expats that were there, or did you have any contact there or no?
No, it was a combination of expats, and I would say it's probably half the expatriate community made up the class, and the other half were Chinese that were working at global companies and manufacturing or whatnot. That their companies were paying for them to do this to sort of skill them up so they could climb the corporate ladder.
I see. In the you recently posted about TSMC disadvantaging U.S. employees, potentially anyway. There's a lawsuit, right? There's a lawsuit of U.S. employees against their employer, TSMC, because they're alleging that TSMC is, giving preference to their Asian employees. What do you make of that?
Okay, so first of all, provide some context for you. A lot of my opinions, people will call them unconventional. And as you rightly point out, I spend a decent amount of time posting on LinkedIn. Not a fan of X. I'm on no real social media. Again, dating myself here. But the reason why I sort of wanted to provide that context is I view the posts that I put up on LinkedIn more as my own personal therapy. Because on a daily basis, part of my life, especially over the last several years, has been a ton of headlines that will come out discussing China. You mentioned TMSC as a good example. But the way that I sort of explain it to everybody is, number one, I almost entirely agree with all the critiques that are leveled at China. Said this to you guys. I mentioned this, Jason, to you when you were in Shanghai.
Yep.
My the struggle that I have is that the manner in which the critiques are presented is woefully incomplete, and this ends up leading to, I think, you'll have outcomes, you'll have opinions, you'll have ideas. I mean, you see it every day now. I mean, China is fully in the zeitgeist. So my thinking was, okay, something will pop up sometime during the day. I roll my eyes around and I just start typing. Okay? I just start like, this makes no sense. There's this to consider. There's that to consider, so on and so forth. And with regard to TMSC, what I found fascinating is it applied to a much bigger construct, a concern actually that I have regarding manufacturing in the United States, or quite frankly, the lack of manufacturing in the United States. And I've gone pretty aggressively in trying to present to people that one of China's greatest geopolitical advantages is being the manufacturer of the world, a workshop of the world, as it's called. And whether you're in Europe or predominantly in the United States, especially, where are you going to be able to buy what it is that you need in terms of goods? Nobody manufactures anything anymore. So you have a Taiwanese semiconductor group comes in, gets granted a ridiculous amount of money from the U.S. government. Okay, little industrial policy, that's great. And then bam, to the question that you were specifically asking, you have a bunch of Americans that start litigating, literally, because, oh, we're not getting the opportunities that we think we should get, and this is discrimination. You know what? It probably is discrimination in terms of more Taiwanese, and remember, we're talking Taiwanese, Chinese, as opposed to anybody else, are getting the jobs because they're the ones that are qualified to run the equipment, to do the job, all of this. I'm not saying that the people that are litigating, the Americans that feel as though this is unfair, don't have their own skill sets, but it drives me absolutely insane that there is this existential geopolitical conflict amongst two powers between the United States and China. And I tell people all the time, there needs to be in the United States not just an industrial policy. We'll see how that plays out, but you need to have a mind shift. You need to think and say, okay, how are we going to go about doing this? Are there going to be situations where, quite frankly, what we have deemed to be unfair labor practices need to be revisited? And so for me, it was just, I remember the story came out. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So I wrote a bit of a diatribe and posted it. And, it's always interesting to see the comments, and sets people off.
No,
Can you imagine, right, Peter? If oh, sorry, Lovis. I was just gonna say, can you imagine, Peter, if back in the late '80s, early '90s, Volkswagen saying, "Hey, let's go move a factory to China," and the Chinese go, "Hey, that's not fair. You're hiring too many Germans here at this factory," right? Like,
well, not only that, but it's a great point. All of the various joint ventures that were set up here over the last 30 years, the Chinese encouraged the foreigners to bring as many of their people in to run those businesses, because it was a informal technology transfer. We want our people to be able to learn from your managers and all the areas that you're doing in this manufacturing stuff. And I look at it exactly the same way, which is, look, if you're bringing in expertise in an area that America does not have, you should welcome it with open arms. And again, it's that litigious nature of the American system that I'm concerned is going to be a significant competitive disadvantage as the United States tries to compete with China going forward.
But it goes beyond the litigiousness, right? I think it reeks of the wokeness a bit to me. That's specifically that article, right? Because it's like so in Europe, right? So sorry, this is a massive tangent, right? But right now Europe has an issue putting together the staff for the European Commission, right? This is the 30 people at the top that oversee, I think, something like 80,000 employees that make up the EU, which by
Mhm.
itself is insane, right? Because we're paying for all that. And they're having an issue putting together this team of 30 people because there's an equity clause. They have to employ as many males as females and whatnot. And so they keep basically complaining at each other. It's like, oh, there's too many men, there's too many women. It's like, well, who do you like? They can only put up who who the countries nominate, right? It's like, well, if you nominate only females or only males, what are they supposed to do? And so to me, I mean, obviously this is different. This is my personal projection when I see a headline like this, right? That it's unfair and they're giving preference to Asian employees, and I'm like, yeah, and probably there's another, there's probably another dimension to this where it's like, well, maybe they bring in too many males or too many females, or who knows. And then if you give people a leverage like actually litigating for stuff like that, I'm like, like you can do that, but then you don't get chips, right?
Mhm.
That that's
Yeah.
basically the long and the short of it.
Yeah, I mean, another way that I try to define it, because again, what I should back up a little bit as well to provide context, which is you probably can imagine with my time here in China that I get labeled a giant panda hugger, like, oh, you just love China. There is no question I do love China. That does not mean that I don't love my home country, America. I love that country too. So when I look at these situations, what is critical, I believe, is for a recognition of the reality, as they say, that is, as opposed to the reality that you wish it to be. That is how China operates. There is the low time preference versus the high time preference of building out a competitive economy. So these two systems are completely at odds. And if I can take that a little bit further to your comment, you know, if the American system were simply to find a way to go back to the dynamic system that existed back in, say, the 1980s, and by no means perfect, but the dynamism that existed, and you say, you want to talk about freedom and whatnot, we are going to offer a system that is open, encourages discussions, encourages innovation, all of these exciting things. And then in China, there is a system that is highly centralized. You can't say anything, right? You basically go and say, these are the two competing systems. But what I find fascinating is that everybody thought when China entered the WTO that over time, China would gain an appreciation for the international norms and rules, the so-called international rules-based order. When in fact, that clearly didn't happen. But more importantly is I can't speak to Europe clearly, but in the United States, I found that the United States has moved further in the direction of China. You've got, oh, we're going to crack down on, various, apps because we have to protect democracy. Or to your point, we're going to have to do things because of diversity, equity, inclusion, what have you. None of that exists here. So, we'll see how things play out over the next 4 years. There's even a question in the back of my mind of whether the United States is at a point now where they're going to effectively be able to right that ship. I'm not one ever to count the United States' ability to reinvent itself and move forward. But I don't know how much time is left. So all of these issues that you're bringing up, completely agree with. And China knows it. And China uses it, I think, to its fullest advantage to be able to gain, its own advantage, whether that's diplomatically, economically, militarily. It's these two systems that are going at it.
So stepping back from my own tangent of bringing up this current of wokeness, so back to the manufacturing expertise of China. So this is an area that I actually happen to know a little bit about because I'm an engineer and I have a small engineering company and we make prototypes of new technology basically for our clients.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to me, and I've never understood it. Like I mean, this has been going on way before I ever stepped foot in an engineering school. But this eagerness, this fervor to outsource manufacturing to China that started, I guess, in the 90s, has I've never, frankly, never fully understood it. It's a way, of course, to make money in the short term, but with the inevitable outcome that you're losing that expertise in-house, so to say,
Mm.
right? And it's like, well, and of course you can talk to no ends, like, well, we still own these subsidiaries in China and whatnot, but it's like, yeah, but making stuff is hard, right? And teaching people how to make stuff is also really difficult. And then if you have China, who's like basically put its national ambition behind figuring out how to make that the thing they run with, that's really hard to undo, right? And now we're at a point where they have become more proficient, I would say, than Germany, where I'm from, the US, where I spend a lot of time, easily more proficient than the US, and have steadily overtaken Germany as well. Germany hasn't made like mass production goods for a long time, but we have held on to some, super deep tech, like super far out, whatever stuff we're like experts in, uh, be it like high precision, whatever, electronics, stuff like that. It's not stuff that you sell a million of, but you sell maybe 10 a year, but those 10 pay, make your company survive. But they're losing that now too,
Yeah.
because the biggest customer for these goods has been China, and they've now figured out how to make it themselves. And then,
Yep.
of course, if it's between, and this is, people are now accusing China of being like nationalist or whatever, or everybody's getting accused of being nationalist at this point. But they're saying like, well, but if you had a choice between a German supplier, if you're a German company, and they make what you need for a reasonable price, and they're Germans, in fact, you would obviously prefer to buy it from them than from
Of course.
overseas.
Of course.
Anybody would make that decision, right? And so now they're like mad. It's like, oh, Chinese won't buy our German goods anymore. It's like, well, it's overpriced, your service is bad, and your products, there's a new version that China came up with. So
Yeah.
what are you going to do?
And even if it was all equal, of course, people would love to deal with people that speak their own language and are comfortable in their own culture, right? Like it's just human nature, and to be angry at that or resentful is just silly, I think, right?
Yeah.
No arguments for me on any of those points, gentlemen.
But Peter, I wanted to ask you something. Through the many years I've been working, right, with this, like let's say with a German company looking to get their product into China, right? And I had to work very closely with Chinese stakeholders as well.
Right.
And there was a period after a few years of us working together, this Chinese gentleman, after a drink, or I think it was after having a drink, he was saying, "Hey, Jason, the difference between a Chinese businessman and somebody from the West is that the Western businesses are usually looking for that profit, right? For that thing to say, I've made that exit, I've got that profit, it's time to go home. Like I've made my bag of gold, right? Like in Chinese, they say." But he's like, for the Chinese, it's always about how do we sustain that cash flow and just have that market share. And that market share in itself means that we will be around for the next chapter, right? Like we'll always be there. We'll always be in the arena. Whereas the Western companies are looking at how they can go in that arena, win that prize, and exit, right? And I thought that was a real amazing insight for me. But I don't know. Do you think that it's true what he said? Does it have legs?
Sure. It was something that I highlighted and pointed to earlier about low time preference versus high time preference. The Chinese are very low time preference. They're looking at market share, again, versus quarterly profits as an example. One of the examples that I've been sort of providing to everybody was ASML. Is it the Netherlands company that makes high-end manufacturing for chips? They came out with their quarterly announcement, I don't know, last month or maybe 2 months ago, and they were off significantly because they couldn't sell into China due to sanctions and whatnot. So the stock was off like 20% or something along those lines. And I think it's indicative of what I refer to as the Faustian bargain, meaning that it's been very clear, and I think Apple for me is I think Jason, you mentioned it, right? It's like Tim Cook is patient zero of the Faustian bargain now with golden handcuffs. Because when these organizations throughout the 90s, especially, but into the years 2000s, when they all came in, it was all about profitability. It was all about, I can make this widget much cheaper in China. And I think what people have a tendency of not really appreciating is the initial rush to come in on the low-cost operating model was, as we all know, right, cheap labor. But again, a reflection of low time preference, high time preference. The Chinese government or the Chinese policymakers predominantly, especially at the provincial levels, they understood that the demographics wasn't on their side and that at some point this was going to be unsustainable. Other countries, whether it was Vietnam, India, anywhere else, were going to be able to provide even lower costs. So what did they do? They said, okay, well, we have to come up with some form of competitive advantage that maintains our competitiveness for manufacturing. And what did they do? They invested aggressively in logistics, roads, rails,
Yeah.
ports, you name
Yeah.
it. So it became this efficiency driver for everybody and anybody to be able to, at scale, reliably produce at the lowest possible price point. And you see this with Apple. Of course, nobody has any of the real details, but Tim Cook just made his third trip as CEO here this year. And how many headlines have we read over the years that, oh, they're going to diversify their distribution network into places like India? Now, I tell people all the time, that sounds great on paper, but at the level and scale that Apple needs to be able to manufacture, forget about price, just reliability and scale. India's not there yet. And then you add on, they don't have the port capabilities, they don't have the rail, they don't have any of this. So what is it that Apple is manufacturing? For the most part, it's the low value add, if you will, elements of an iPhone, like the back of the iPhone or something along those lines. So I think this is a critical point of understanding that goes to your question, Jason, about, are you looking at quarterly profits or are you looking at solidifying a true competitive advantage? And China's done it. And, as a final point, with the last 48 hours or whatever it's been with the, President-elect Trump talking about tariffs and whatnot, I've been inundated with emails and whatnot asking about it. And I distinctly remember being very public, even going on TV back in 2017 and 2018 during Trade War I. I made the point, this is great. It's just 10 years too late. And that was 6 years ago. So again, I don't want to say that the United States is going to find itself in a undefensible position, but there are going to need to be some radical policy decisions that go beyond just tariffs. But we're in purgatory right now. I don't even know who's president anymore. Is Biden running the show or is Trump running the show?
Hey, Peter, just so cool that you mentioned the logistics side of things, right? In 2018, 2019, I visited a factory in Vietnam that was kind of close to the border, right? Like in between Hanoi and And what was happening was a Chinese solar cell manufacturing company decided to set up another company in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically traveled there, and the whole meeting was in Chinese, right? Like, so the commercial guys, the operations guys, the technology guys, everyone's Chinese, right? So they basically just cut and pasted none of this TSMC related issues, right, to speak of. And so then after we had our discussions, we just candidly asked, like, hey, why do you move? Why do this in Vietnam, right? And they said, oh, we thought, first of all, with sanctions and stuff, it's always good to diversify. At the moment, if anytime somebody says we can't sell product from China, then we can sell it from Vietnam. That's not an issue yet. Back then, it wasn't. But then we said, so is it cheaper then? Is it, besides that, is it cheaper? He said, yeah, we thought so because things were getting so expensive in Suzhou, right? And even when we went further out, other cities like in that area in China, it was still getting, it's still expensive compared to Vietnam. But what they found out was after moving to Vietnam, getting that quote unquote cheaper labor and whatnot, cheaper land, cheaper everything, they said they still couldn't compete with their Chinese factories because of logistics.
Yeah.
Right? What needed 6 hours? Like if there was a line that was down, they needed 6 hours to get spare parts. In Vietnam, you'd need 3 days.
Yeah.
And just that was enough to bring their whole cost structure up, right? And yes, solar cell manufacturing is not super duper simple, but it's still not as complex as manufacturing an iPhone, I would think, right? And so I can only imagine when somebody says India's gonna eat China's lunch in manufacturing things like as high end as an iPhone, I always chuckle to myself, right? Like I don't know if they have they even been there to see what's it like on the ground, right?
Again, I've just found that it's a lot of these political realities, which is, there's like I said, there's a reason why Tim Cook has come back here 3 times, why he's meeting with the premier. They have had the better part of 4 years at a minimum to be able to try to do something. And look, Apple's got a ton of cash. If they want to get something done, they can get something done. But it's clearly beyond whatever Apple can do as a sole company. It's about the genuine infrastructure, and I don't know exactly how this gets replicated elsewhere, let alone in the United States or let's say Germany or somewhere else in Europe. Because we haven't even talked about things like, I mean, Lovis, you talked a little bit, but are there people to be able to do the jobs? Like, even something that would be on a low value add type of manufacturing good. We're talking, and I think the way that I phrased it was, it is impossible to take a 30-year trajectory in terms of globalization where China has become the factory of the world and reverse that overnight. I don't even think it's something that can be reversed in a matter of years. And, we're just smack dab in the middle of it. And I think no matter what, just using the America as the example, I think no matter what America may do on an industrial policy standpoint, they're going to set up some, I don't know, whatever widget they want to say they want to bring back onshore to the United States. Okay, you can do that, but it's still, even with the tariffs, going to be cheaper to buy from your Chinese supplier. Like again, the level of scale that has been created in China for manufacturing has reduced the per unit cost of everything to pennies.
Yeah.
I'm talking anything and everything. And that, again, I'm not saying is insurmountable, but a different approach, very strongly believe this, a different approach in terms of how America is going to go about addressing this is going to be required. And I do not see anything from the policy prescriptions that are coming out right now. I don't even think they understand the problem, let alone are in a position where they have solutions to effectively address that problem.
No, it's very simply put, right? So my company is in Texas, in Dallas. If I order a part from California and I order one from Shenzhen at the same time, I'll get the Shenzhen part faster.
Yep.
And the shipping cost is obviously way higher from China because it's way more miles. But even factoring in the shipping cost, it's usually cheaper by 50%, right? At least. Yep. And the difference is in Shenzhen, if I order like a stainless steel CNC part or whatever, there's a whole, I haven't been, right? But just from the impression I get and from the level of like the quality of service that I receive even, right? They're so on the ball. I get emails replied to within 2 or 3 hours. I get quotes turned around in less than a day. Even when I make changes, they stay friendly. They're on it all the time. And then you push go, you figure out a way to pay, which is not always easy. and then they put like afterburners on the thing, and you have to be careful that it doesn't like hit you in the head, right? Like that's how fast you get it.
Yep.
And if you deal with an American supplier, to even get somebody to respond to an email is impossible. If you're lucky, you can talk to them on the phone. Then it's usually like, oh man, we can't even get to this until like 3 weeks from now. It's just, and as a small business owner, I'm happy for every business that is booked, right? That is so booked that they don't even have to bother with a new client. I'm happy, right? But I don't think that this can go on for very long, right? Because like you have this like hyper scale like industrial manufacturing thing in China competing with like a mom and pop shop in California, for example, or wherever, right? In Ohio, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Obviously everybody's going to go to the more comfortable and cheaper route. And so it's not even a matter of, I don't know, I think the like a little bit like you said, like it's already too late, right? The fight's already won. And something that I think will be required in the West, because it's not just the United States, is like this, like mustering the will to bring this back. And that's, I think it goes far beyond just policy, right? Like you have to really ignite the will for people to want to go and do that type of work again.
Yeah.
And that's, I think a lot of people in the West think that we're kind of beyond that and like too good for that maybe, or something like that. And that, how do you bring that back, right? That's tough.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting points to make, and I appreciate that color, Lovis, because one of the things that I hear all the time, right, is, oh, the reason China is so competitive is because of all of these unfair state subsidies that are given to Chinese companies. And I tell people, yes, I'm sure some of that goes on at the most industrial level. 90% has nothing to do with regard of being supported by the state. It's about the efficiency and the capitalist drive to be able to meet client demands, everything that you just described. I mean, there are countless business people that I know here. And it pains me to say this, but it reminds me of my professional youth, of what the United States was like. It was a go-to attitude. We can get this done. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness, just go out and do these things. And that go-to attitude, which used to be associated with the United States of America, I can't say it doesn't exist there. I mean, I have to be at least a little humble and say I haven't spent an enormous amount of time living in my home country, but I know for a fact that it is prevalent throughout all of China. And, a lot of it are these, privately run companies. They have the sweat equity. This is on them. All of this. And like you said, I think it's a good point. Is there the will of the people to go back to the days of I'm gonna put in the time, the energy, and the sweat to be able to make something happen, as opposed to have the the economy be financialized or service focused, or everybody wants to be an influencer, whatever the case might be. And again, not to keep harping and bringing you back to this point, but I think it's critical, is these dynamics I do not see as being properly addressed throughout the policy center in Washington, D.C. or New York or elsewhere. And more concerning, in fact, is we're just going to blame the other guy for all of what ails us. Now,
Right.
One of the reasons why I'm super glad to be able to be on here with you, and I do this, privately with a bunch of different groups and elsewhere, is to try and communicate that sort of message, which is you've got to be able to look at yourself and what you need to do, rather than point to China and saying it's all China's fault. Again, I am not saying that there is not a degree of fault in various issues that can be laid at China's feet. Absolutely sure. But you're only going to be able to improve. You're only going to be able to address those issues, whatever the case, the policy prescriptions, by yourself. Pointing to somebody else and faulting them for your problems, that's a recipe for disaster.
You're basically admitting to being a victim, right? And victims are powerless, right?
Mm-hmm.
if you just sit there and say, hey, we can't, it's their fault, and that's why we're living the way we are, you're basically putting your hand up to say, hey, look, I'm a poor victim, right?
Well, then one of the basic lessons of free markets, right, is a tariff. A tariff is essentially a wall, right, that you put up. And what you said earlier, Peter, even with the tariff, I would also say that most goods will still be way cheaper to buy from China. But say you make the tariff just high enough, and then you want to reshore manufacturing in the U.S. That's a process that takes a couple of years.
Or decades.
Right? Yeah, best case, couple of years, right? And then you didn't, in fact, increase productivity in the U.S. necessarily, right? You didn't, in fact, you didn't necessarily create a single job that's new. You may have taken people that are skilled from one factory, put them into another,
Right.
unless you also heavily invest in increasing productivity in the United States or in Europe or wherever. You're not actually making the pie bigger. So you didn't actually solve an economic problem on the global scale at all. You're just, you put some money from your left pocket in your right pocket, but that's about it. so
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
I think it's potentially more concerning than just that, because there's going to be a transition period in which productivity sort of at the top line is probably going to decrease, because you're going back to do things that haven't been done in 30 years.
Right,
So
because you have
the
the
best,
learning curve all over again, right? Yeah.
correct. So you have to look at it in a way of this is one of the reasons why, when I look at the situation as it is right now, is the United States and China at some point have to reach a grand bargain. Where is that going to reside? And because I don't. Okay, number one is, your comparative advantage. What do you do that's best? China does manufacturing. That's what it does best. The United States does high tech, servicing, a whole bunch of other things. That's what they do best. That's what each of these groups should be focused on, and finding a way to then work together and say, okay, how do we maintain this relationship that's been, for the most part, beneficial for both parties? The variable that has changed, however, is the worker in the United States. You've reached a point where you've squeezed out as much of that profitability from that process as is possible, probably more so that you've gotten to a populist movement of some sort. So I don't really know what they're going to be. I think the American government is going to have to figure out where they're going to pick their fights when it comes to manufacturing, because does the United States really want to bring back, let's say, manufacturing of underwear or socks or paper clips? Probably not. But I always tell people, you can't be a little bit pregnant when you do these approaches to tariffs. If you're going to say we're going to do tariffs on 10% on everything that is essentially everything that every American buys, period.
Yeah. I mean, so just from my insight, right, living in Germany, America is in a very odd position for not having tariffs basically on anything. That's actually very strange. Germany has had tariffs for, I don't know, forever on everything, right? So if you, that's why the EU is such a big deal, because within the EU there's no import tariffs, even though I think there might still be some hidden away somewhere, but generally speaking. But then you have odd things like if you want to import a car from the US, if you do it through a port in the Netherlands, it's cheaper than if you go through Hamburg. And there's like weird stuff like that. But I was always amazed that I could just go, when I'm in the US, I can just hop on Alibaba.com and order whatever. And I was like, oh, what about customs? And they're like, what customs? There's no customs. And I'm like, in Germany, every single package gets held up, right? Doesn't matter what's in it. They make sure that it's officially declared and you pay. And often, just because the processing of that is so expensive, you buy something for $30 from China, you end up with a tariff that's like 28, because 25 of that is just the person handling it, right? That's what you're paying for. So in that case, like, I guess it is protecting jobs, but they're actually with the customs officials, not necessarily in manufacturing. Yeah. But So on one hand, I think US should put up some tariffs that make sense. Right? It's a bit crazy to me to not have any, but that doesn't really solve a problem, right? You have to go far beyond that, right? I think so. We're basically in agreement with that. Jason, I wanted to touch a little bit on, just kind of recap a little bit your recent experience going to Shanghai. Like, you had told me in so many words how blown away you were, and you've been to China several times, right? So why was your most recent visit different, I guess? Do you
Yeah.
know?
I was thinking about it too, right? Because I think since 2015, I've been to China maybe, I don't know, at least 6 times, 7 times a year, right? Besides the COVID years. And I've worked with them, with people there, traveled all around. So I've seen the country before, you know. But I think this time what was different for me, besides meeting Peter, was that I feel like maybe in the past I always remembered coming home to wherever home was in the West, saying, hey, the Chinese are running so fast. Once they catch up, they're not gonna, there's no chance, right, for the West to keep up once they overtake. That was the way I was thinking about it back then. But this time it was so obvious to me that it's not just that the Chinese are running really fast. It seems to me like people in the West have stopped running, right? They've actually just sat down or even turned around. And I think that's when it hit me, you know, that the whole philosophy of what's driving the zeitgeist of the place is different, you know. In the West now, the West has changed so much over the last 8 years. China's just been going full speed. But it seems to me like the West has turned and become, I don't know, a bit too self-loathing, a bit too self-critical, a bit too demotivated, right? And it's painful to watch. And I think when I made the comment that it was when you can speak the language and you're there often enough, it feels like it's a parallel universe. I guess it's also because of that, because there's no way for me to illustrate that to people that are not in China. How do I explain to somebody in the West? Like, how do I explain to my German in-laws, right, that, hey, they're living on another planet. They're doing things just so differently, right? I remember drawing one analogy once where I was saying, in the West, it seems like you're sitting in an old BMW or maybe even a new one, right? And everyone in the car is talking about how you can make the car a little bit better. Maybe, you know, you just need to change the tires, or maybe if you put a turbo in there or whatever, right? And while they're sitting on the side of the road discussing how to modify their BMW, there's this Chinese Gaotie, like this high-speed rail train just coming like full speed, right? And you don't know. You might hear it, but by the time you hear it, it's too late, and then it's just gone, right? And everyone's then in the car going like, "Oh my gosh, like, oh, we should put up tariffs, or we should do this and that." But the train's left, right? So maybe that's why this time was so different for me, because I guess it's not only China that's been, you know, just compounding on what they've built, but also I feel this this demoralization in the West somehow. And Peter, I wanted to ask, you go home, right? You told me you still go home pretty regularly, and you said, you know, you love your home country. My dad, when he left Australia, I think he was also in his 20s, right? And he ended up living nearly his whole life in Southeast Asia, right?
Yep.
And he told me, when, you know, when I was turning, I don't know, when I was about 18 or 20, I was asking him, hey, so Dad, we're gonna move back to Australia? And he's like, I can't, you know, like, I go home, I speak like an Aussie, right? I have a blue passport, and I watch the cricket, and I have a beer at the bar, but it's not the same. Like, I can't get used to it anymore, right? It's not
Mhm.
the place that I knew. And after being in Asia for that long, he always struggled. He said he hated going back to work, right? He's like, everybody's wavelength was different. They were moving on a different speed. And this was, I don't know, 20 years ago, right? So yeah, sorry, long-winded, but
Sorry.
yeah, that's why I was saying I feel this time I felt so different when I came back.
No, and I think, remind me again. So you were back, what was it, October of 2024, right?
Yeah, and then I was back twice more in 2024, like I think Jan 2024, June 2024,
Yeah.
and
So
yeah,
I think one of the things that's interesting is you're absolutely right. I would say this year especially is really the first year where the yoke of we call it the dark times of 2022, the lockdowns, was the first year where people were like, okay, we're kind of back to normal. And you see all these headlines in the media in the U.S. or elsewhere, and they're talking about property crisis or debt burdens and all that, which is there's no argument here. Agreed with all of that. But the interesting point is people have rebounded, if you want, a little bit more positively, especially in the second half of the year. And a lot of it has to do, I think, in September. And again, this kind of matches with when you were here, but it was been building. But in September, there were some significant government policies that were introduced. Clearly communicating to the nation that a floor was going to be put underneath what appeared to be a continually deteriorating economic situation. So people began to get a little bit more excited. But for me personally, and I have to be very upfront with you guys and anybody who listens to this later on, I can only speak about Shanghai. I'm not out in the hinterlands. I don't even go to Beijing. I am not a fan of Beijing. So I don't necessarily travel, exclusively all around the country. But Shanghai is great because you do end up meeting people from all around the country. And, they come across some, crazy white guy that speaks Mandarin, and all of a sudden they have a ton of questions. So I ask the questions back. I'm like, hey, what's going on? What have you? And, people are doing better, at least the ones that I've engaged with. So I think you came at a really good time. The trajectory has continued to be upward, albeit with a very tiny slope. Um, but there are reasons for this. I mean, there's government policy that is in place that is seeking, in my opinion, to restructure what has historically been a I don't know, a more decentralized, if you will, less productivity to a certain extent type of economic model to one that needs to fundamentally shift. Again, if we just use the analogy I'd mentioned before about manufacturing initially was able to build a foundation off of low cost labor. It was not sustainable, so they had to move into logistics and all the other bits to keep costs down. The same thing goes for the economy writ large. The approaches that were taken for a 30-year period were great for that period of time, but I always laugh with someone like Xi Jinping, who gets listed as an autocrat or a dictator or a totalitarian or whatever he gets labeled with. My immediate response is, hey man, this is a guy that came into office. He could have put his 10 years in, retired, and made the problem somebody else's. He and hindsight being 2020, I did not see it, but in 2012, it's very clear now that the trajectory of where China was heading was not sustainable. All of the elements that were driving it, from infrastructure spending to housing, even within the party, there was a lot of sort of jockeying for position, if you will. And Xi Jinping comes in, he's like, all right, we need to move into a new model, and we're going to have to re-centralize power. And that's what's been ongoing for the last decade plus now. And again, if you think about it, it's been a decade and they're still trying to work through all of this. So here's an example where China already had that so-called low cost option with the 30 years of the economy. Now the response is, we're going to radically change the economic model, which should be something to pay very close attention to. Because now I'm very clear with people that I'll talk to about this and say, I have no idea if it's going to work. They do have a major local government debt issue. They have a very serious issue with regard to property. Tons of different stuff, demographics, all of these things. And if you were to take a moment and look at these statically, you would think, yeah, it's over for China. Nothing's going to happen. The road, this is the best way to put it, the road to calling China's collapse is littered with more dead bodies in my 30 years than you can possibly imagine. Right? People have been trying to call this forever. I'm not saying this time is going to be different. What I'm trying to caution people on is I would rather see the likes of Washington or Berlin or Paris or elsewhere say, hey, we need to take this seriously. We can't risk that our future is dependent on China collapsing, right? I mean, that's kind of what, let's hope it's not going to happen. And if it does, well, I think that's a whole bigger problem. But a bit of a tirade, and my apologies. I just think it's super fascinating to have that understanding of China and the current policymakers are making really hard decisions. I mean, they just said we're raising the retirement age. Okay. Everywhere from Europe to the United States has an entitlement problem. I mean, I think Macron tried to do something on retirement in France, and it just set off. I think that was like the yellow vest revolution, or whatever it was, a few years ago. So now, maybe you don't like the authoritarian approach or the re-centralized approach or whatever you want to frame it or call it, but hard choices are being made. And my personal belief is the foundation is being laid for the next leg up, as for China's economy. So we'll see.
Is question for me to ask, because I have the least experience in it, but first of all, let me start with you, Peter. Do you consider yourself a freedom-minded person? Do you care about freedom?
Hell yeah.
How would you say you're, spending actually, like you said, you actually spend more of your life in Shanghai than you have in the US. How does it compare? Like, because when you just listen to the rhetoric that you hear in the West, there ain't nobody free in China, right? But so how's it possible?
Well, how it's possible is I recognize that I'm not living in the United States. I'm living in China. I can hold two different ideas together at the same time, which is I'm a freedom loving. I believe that you need to be able to go out. You need to have the ability to have agency, be unencumbered, and do what it is that you want to do and how to do it. In China, you would be surprised. In a number of different facets, you're able to do that. Now, I want to take a step back for a minute. We are here having a conversation on a platform in which I am in China, and we can talk about anything. We can talk about Taiwan, we can talk about Xinjiang, all that. Nobody's knocking on my door. All right. So I am fully aware of what the rules of engagement are here. The rules of engagement in China are not the rules of engagement of any other country. There is this, if I can be direct, a level of arrogance, especially amongst the Americans, I find, where they will say, this is what it means to be free. This is what you need to do. Now, I may agree with those facets, but I'm not going to go to somebody else who's been around for 5,000 years that has a completely different view on what it means to have a country and a people and a society, that I call it the Judeo-Christian ethos, meaning that the so-called great powers of the last couple hundred of years have operated from the standpoint of, being kind to one another, contracts like you shake your hand, all these things. Doesn't work that way in China. You have to not just pay lip service to the idea that there are cultural differences. You have to recognize and adapt. And sometimes that means I'm not going to engage in China. Now, I've ultimately become over time sort of the China whisperer to some, saying, well, what is this and what do you do here? And I help global companies try to figure that out. But what I think, Lovis, is really fascinating is the disconnect between how the average Chinese thinks of freedom versus how the average, say, American thinks about freedom. So when you talk to the average Chinese, their attitude is the government knows everything that we do. Everything's like, I have my ID card, your Shenzhen, it's on everything. It's on your phone. It's like, everything is out there about every individual. And they're like, this is our lot in life. This is how we live. And we can have a debate of whether that's something that you agree with or don't agree with, but that is how the rules of engagement here. What the Chinese find absolutely fascinating to the person, individuals, is that they'll turn to me and say, well, this is the same system that you have in the United States, right? And I'm like, well, yes, now, but it wasn't always that way. Because they look and they say, the government knows they follow all of your tech, right? They have a ton of information on you. You can get debanked. You can have all of these issues that will pop up. And, but when you talk to the average American, they're like, freedom, baby. But how delusional is that right now? I think it's very delusional. So the Chinese know their lot in life. The Americans, again, I think are to a certain degree delusional when I speak with them. So I can, to your question, say, I'm all about freedom. I'm all about personal freedom, personally. Right? I do not believe in telling anybody what to do or anything else unless there's some sort of agreement. I tell my employees what to do because that's what our agreement is, right? But I'm in no way, shape, or form, nor will I ever try to tell any Chinese what they should do or what they should think about. I think the interesting thing about, Taiwan, I'm like, hey, man, I'm not Chinese. I don't have any dog in this race, period. Like, we need to protect. I mean, I have opinions on it, don't get me wrong. But I think that when you look at it, you have to recognize the dynamics of it. And the United States, they love running around saying, hey, this is how things need to be done without any regard to, no, this is how you want things to be done, not necessarily how they should be done. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context to the question.
This was a very nuanced explanation of it, Peter.
No.
No.
You know what it was? I hate that word, and I hate that word. No, it was a broadly contextualized answer. And that goes to my point about like the framing of all Chinese aren't free. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Right? And how can you say that about something else? I mean, my favorite one that has popped up is, we're doing this for you to protect democracy. Give me a break. Like, the government in the United States wants to ban TikTok to protect democracy and because the Communist Party is stealing all the Americans' information. Now, do I think the app should be banned? Hell yes. I think the app should definitely be banned, but not for those reasons. I think the app should be banned, and I think this is an important part of American policy. The app should be banned because no American apps are allowed in China. So if our apps aren't allowed in your country, no apps from you should be in our country. And the real reason, I think everybody knows, is that Facebook, Meta, whatever it's called, Google, and all of these American companies have had their market share and advertising revenue decimated by TikTok. So regulatory capture is how I view it. Just ban them, get them sold here to somebody else so that we can get our market share and ad revenue back, and then our stock price goes up, aka low time or high time preference thinking.
Yeah, I think it probably should be banned too because it's a productivity killer like no other.
Very true.
And it seems like the West needs every little bit of productivity they can get. But no, you're completely right. Of course, the apps are banned. Try to use Google anything in China is very difficult if it works at all. And yeah, it was like, I think when TikTok started taking off, it was the first time that Meta or whatever had, like, what was it? Like no net growth in user accounts for the first time in like since existence or something. And they were super rattled by that. Yeah. So interesting. No, of course, I said the word nuanced on purpose to set you off.
I know. I appreciate it.
But I think, I mean, in a day and age where in Europe and in the US, people get punished for stuff they say on social media, it's really
Mhm.
hard, I think, to make the argument that we're free, or I guess how free we are. But then, of course, it's always like, well, no, we have to ban that person because they are hurting other people's freedoms. And I'm like, how do you figure that? I don't know. I can never wrap my head around that. But I guess in a way, what you're saying is the Chinese are a lot more acutely aware that everything they do is being monitored, and in
Mhm.
that way, it's a bit more honest, right? Because over here, they'll they're pretending they're not listening to everything I'm saying, and they're not
Right.
tracking me wherever I go. They're like, no, no, because you clicked only essential cookies, we're not watching. It's like, no, of course you are. Like just because there's a pop-up banner that somehow is the European Privacy Act main result
Yeah.
doesn't mean that I'm actually any more private than before. So I do appreciate the transparency, I guess, in that sense, that it's like, no, that here's what to expect, right? If you, but then how does it manifest? Like, and I'm literally asking because I don't know.
Yeah.
If you voice an opinion as a Chinese person in China, like where are the bounds? Like where do people get in trouble, or do they get in trouble, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, it. Yes, you can get in trouble, clearly, but there's it the misrepresentation of you say something that does not align or falls outside of the acceptable boundaries, right? You're not like they're not kicking the doors down and grabbing you, throwing the back of the van. Um, Normally, a lot of the things that get voiced because of the day and age are on social media. So if you want to use like WeChat as an example, some people I know have said things on WeChat that, let's say, play in the gray area of what is allowed or not allowed in terms of commentary. And you'll actually get some message from somewhere that says, the commentary that you're making falls outside of what we consider to be appropriate. And you're like, okay. So there's a level of conditioning that's been going on. And again, it's not great. I can understand that. But I think one of the best examples that I can give you is from 2022 during the lockdown when it was dragged on for the better part of a year. And by the time November came around, all of a sudden Beijing said, okay, here are, I don't know, 10 or 13 new policies. We're basically ending zero COVID, just like that. It was on a Thursday or something, Thursday night or something, late November. And it was very clear that the Shanghai government didn't really know what their KPIs were anymore. It was, okay, our KPIs were people cannot get infected. Every time we get someone infected, we have a problem. They didn't say in there that that was no longer a KPI. So that kind of was like, is that still there? But the other policy points were lift everything up, no more testing, all of this. So the Shanghai government kind of stopped and just, they didn't know what to do. So what happened? People took to the streets. And interestingly enough, main road called Wulamuchi Road, quite popular actually. Our apartment, my wife and I live, right around the corner, and we were like, "What is going on?" And we looked down, and yeah, there were people protesting. It was like a Saturday night protest. And during those protests, there were people that were saying things like "down with Xi Jinping" and all this other kind of stuff. Very inflammatory. And yeah, big show up of police and everything else. Wasn't I wouldn't say anywhere near it wasn't overly aggressive. It was just show of force type of thing. But what I found fascinating was on Monday, Beijing was like, "What are you? We told you lift everything." So they put out like another 10 policy points that literally said, "Okay, don't worry about people if they get infected, what have you." And man, I will tell you, all of testing vestibules, all of the QR codes, everything gone in 24 hours. And everybody was like, "Oh, great." Like it, so there is this sort of delicate dance that goes on between the leadership and the populace. So I think it's when you're looking at it, I think the critical element that I keep coming back to is the rules of engagement, right? That's why I said it's not nuanced; it's different. Different matters, and you have to have as best as you can an understanding of what those differences are. So I will give you another example. I call it the 3 knock rule, meaning if you're, especially amongst the foreigners, but even the Chinese, if you're vocal or talking about something, even in like a business environment like myself, and something goes out, somebody somewhere, like I'm under no like false imagination that there's some giant file on me somewhere, right? And as a foreigner, 30 years in China, someone's like, "Who is this crazy guy?" So, if I were to say something or someone in my situation were to say something, I would get probably somebody out of the blue and be like, "Hey, just, not great." They're like, "Oh, okay, I got it." Now, I've seen situations where there have been very, and I will not name names, but people who have been very arrogant to the point where they were told not to do something. Okay. They kept doing it. And then it was like kind of a formal sit down saying, "Hey, we don't do these things anymore." And I was like, "Okay, that's your second knock." But they kept doing it. Then the door gets kicked in. Then the police come in. Then you get arrested. And in those situations, I find it interesting because I know these individuals and I've seen them, go to jail, come out of jail, go back to their home countries. And I sit there going, the revisionist history of these stories boggles my mind. Like, I can't tell you anyone in these situations where it's like, wow, that should not have happened. China is, I find it to be a very reasonable place when it comes to what the lines are. And again, you have to, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's great. There's self-censorship. There's all these things. There's things you can't say, but that's just what it is in China.
Is it outlined somewhere what you can and cannot say? Like, this sounds dumb, like a dumb question, but is it?
No. It's no. This is the thing that I love the most about being here is you talked about freedom. Okay. One of the greatest things about sort of freedom in the Chinese concept is the gray area. And I think, Jason, you and I may have talked about this when you were in Shanghai, which is there's a ton of like, the rules are always going to be open to interpretation. Like if you have anybody out there that's doing something wrong, you can find something that you can go after them for. It's like, there's nothing you can do. But there's this beautiful gray area where, if you're doing something and, it's not something that would be against the party or, screwing around with the financial markets or something big, you can really become your own entrepreneur. You can have that agency to go out and do things. And then if you push that sort of gray area, you'll find pushback. In my company, I wanted to do something. I went to the regulator. I was like, "Hey, what do you think about this new service I'm thinking about?" And they said to me in Chinese, 我感觉是太早了, which is, I think it's a little early. I was like, okay, that's a no. So, it's a bit of a dance, but no, nothing's written down. It's a cultural thing. And again, as you probably can tell from I just love this part of living.
I think it's very similar in Singapore, actually. One good example is migration, rules of immigration, right? In the West, they have very, very clear-cut rules. Hey, you do this and that and this and that. You stay how many years, and then, on this and that track, you get a permanent residency, and then that's it, right? There's no discussion about whether you get it or not. In Singapore, it's like, apply, we'll see, and we'll let you know, right? And some people get it and some people don't, right? And it's just such an elegant way of managing whatever needs to be managed. And usually these situations are always in flux. So why not give the decision maker the opportunity to make best decisions within a certain boundary set, right? At that time, so that's something that I think for the Western mind, it's a bit difficult for them to grasp, because they think about it in terms of, then that's not quote unquote fair, and right. But I think very similar.
Let me just add sort of the other side of the equation, which is, I talk about the gray area in China, or you're talking about immigration in a place like Singapore. This has always existed. This environment's always existed. What has changed, and I've seen this in the business that I run, is global institutions, we'll just broadly call them companies or whatever, over the past 15 years have become almost completely unwilling to assume any uncertainty in any business risk. They want complete clarity in whatever it is that they're going to be able to do. So when they come to a place like China, they say, show me where in the rules it says I can do this and how to do it. And I kind of shrug my shoulders and I'm like, you're in the wrong market. Because you have to look and say, number one, if it says in the rules you can't do this, then you can't do it. If it doesn't say you can't do it, then it's open to interpretation. 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, people got that. Decision makers understood that. It was, okay, I'm going to take a business risk. I'm going to try this out, go from there and see where things. Today, absolutely not. You have to have all risk mitigated. You cannot have any uncertainty. I find it fascinating. I'm not sure if you have to deal with this in the work that you do, but in sort of the business I'm in with the clients I work with, there are these things called legal opinions, meaning, oh, we want to do something in a certain market. We don't really know the market. We're going to go to a lawyer and we're going to ask them to give us their opinion on what can and can't be done. Makes sense, works all around the world, fine. The problem is in China, the rules are not clear. They're very ambiguous. China loves to be able to have as much flexibility in the interpretation of the rules that trying to nail something down specifically can be difficult. So I have clients who are like, oh, we need to go out and get a legal opinion. I said, what are you talking about? I said, you're going to go to the lawyer. I said, the lawyer's probably just going to tell you what you want to hear, because they can look at the law any way they want and come up with a legal opinion that gives you that sort of assurance, if you will. So I just find it, I find it perplexing. I find it a waste of money. But again, as much as China has this gray area, you have global investors and global, multinationals that either have operations here or are trying to look at doing something here. And part of the reason why, there has been less excitement over China is we don't get the rules. We don't understand what we can do or can't do. That's, quite frankly, that's where the alpha is. That's how you make revenue and how you generate profit.
Yeah, that's what makes those entrepreneurs excited, right? They see how they can be flexible, they can understand the different stakeholders, they can manage everyone's expectations, and then come up with something where most people are happy and they don't get cut at the knees, right? And then they make a ton of money.
Correct.
Yeah. Actually, Peter, in the last few years, I've made it a point for myself. You mentioned just now about freedom and concepts like democracy and stuff like that, right? And I noticed that oftentimes it'd be much more helpful to just go one step further, dig a little deeper, and just discuss what is that person's definition of that word, right? Because I've noticed watching Germans speaking to Chinese or Americans speaking to Singaporeans or whatever, right? They'd say, oh, you're not democratic or you're not free. But I realized they're just talking past each other because whatever their version of freedom is different, right? Democracy, like what does that mean, right? Like if I go to China, they go, hey, you tell me your country's democratic, but everyone in the G7's got a approval rating of less than 40. So how democratic's that, right? And they said, but I'm sure there's more than 40% of the people in China that would be happy to keep the current government in place. So who's actually more democratic at the moment, Yeah, things like freedom. They say, hey, I visited Germany and I go to a football game and I see like hundreds of stormtroopers staring down at me behind their bulletproof vests and their shields. And you're telling me that you're super free, like walk around this whatever unheard of city in China. There are no police there. And if they are, they're super courteous and you view them as if they're on your side. Right? Whereas when you're in the West, the police are often seen as against you, right? You have to be careful when the police is there.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was pretty cool to think about it in those terms, right? What's the definition of freedom that we're actually talking about right now? What's the definition of democracy that we're actually discussing, right?
Yeah, and for me, I mean, that's why I said before. I mean, I just view freedom as individual agency, and I believe the Chinese have an enormous amount of agency. They can go out and do what they're going to want to do. Now, are there things like capital controls? Yes. You know, is it difficult to be able to move around? There are certain restrictions, sure, but there's a significant amount of agency I find at the individual level. And I would say the vast majority of people, they don't look to the government as the solution. I mean, another anecdote I can share with you is, COVID hit here first. And I was, at the time, was living downtown, right in smack in the middle of the town of Shanghai. And the street that it was off from me had, for about maybe half a kilometer or a bit longer, nothing but sort of small shops. They sold everything from slippers to iPhone cases to noodles, whatever. 35% of them went out of business after about a month. How much fiscal support did the government give to the people of their nation here? Zero. Everybody kind of knew, okay, the groups that I had talked to that had started their own companies or their own little businesses outside, they were like, well, this is what happens. We took a risk and okay. Nobody really was complaining that the government wasn't doing anything for them. Everybody understood that it was their responsibility, that this was what was happening. They were going to have to take care of themselves. I find it fascinating that that's sort of a storyline that never really gets highlighted or discussed elsewhere. And then after 2 months of that, all of those stores that shut down, somebody else was in there with something new. Someone viewed it as an opportunity. So it's that kind of agency that I'm talking about. And I don't think anybody really here has any desire to be in the realm of politics or the government or the party. We just want to have a good time. We want to drink our baijiu, smoke our cigarettes, eat some great food, chat with our friends, live a great life.
Yeah, I agree. And you hardly hear people talk about politics. That's also an amazing thing for me. Whenever I travel back home to Singapore, I'm going around China, right? Like, if they do talk about it, they're talking about the 外国 politics, right? The politics overseas. How does that influence our lives?
Yeah.
Right. But they never ever talk about local politics, right?
Yeah.
And people tell me as if like that's a bad thing because it means they're not politically minded or whatever. But when you've experienced both, I don't know. I don't know if it's a bad thing because sometimes in the West, when you talk to people, the first thing you hear is, "Hey, what color are you? Like, what party are you for?" Right? Like, you know what I mean?
Color.
Yeah, that color.
Okay.
Which ideology are you part of, right? Like which to me it's almost like a religion, right? Which belief system are you locked into? And I'm going to identify you as that person first before I identify you as a German or as an American or as an Australian, right?
Yeah.
But in Singapore, it's like we're all Singaporean. Oh, you think something else? That's interesting, but we're still one, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I found that very refreshing I always find it refreshing. And going back to freedom and definitions, what you said was so interesting, right? Your self-agency. Because in Chinese, the words for freedom, 自由, is in essence, that's what it means, right? Yeah. The first word is self, and the second word is the reason or the cause, right? Or where you're from.
Yep.
So yeah, very, 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 very cool to dig into the definitions.
And it translates, and I think if I were to stress anything else, there is a real unfortunate chauvinism, I believe is the proper word for it, where the way that we operate as those in America or Europe or elsewhere, we want to make sure, neo-colonialism even. It's like, you have to do it this way elsewhere because we believe that our system is better. Maybe it is. Maybe your system for your nation for your people. Maybe it is better, but that doesn't necessarily, or it shouldn't mean that you should try and push that onto others with a different culture, a different background, different history, a different society. And, you know, you see this all the time. So I'm always fascinated in seeing how both of these things.
Peter, how would you, I guess, rate prospective opportunity in China today? Do you think it's still a great place to go and set up business, or has it changed over the last 2 decades? Like, would you say it's better now? Is it worse? Like, where are we at?
Okay, so number one, it depends on the industry.
Yeah.
This is not 10, 15 years ago. You're going to have, if you're in, say, manufacturing, you're going to have certain players that are there that are probably going to be in a better situation than you're in. But the high level answer is there is an enormous amount of opportunity here. Because I do find in certain areas, like, I mean, I can talk about financial services. That's what I do. The local competitors here are so ossified. They're very inefficient. The way that I phrase it all the time is the level of inefficiencies that can be exploited are off the charts. However, what I have found, and again, this goes back to a bit of my comments regarding dealing with zero business risk. You'll have organizations that will come in, they can set up 100% own, they can try to be competitive. But the manner in which I have found large organizations, so let's talk about large organizations, they focus too much on things like risk, compliance, legal. There's a lot more pressure applied on local operations that really, as the saying goes, demands all the responsibility to be able to achieve success, but provides almost none of the authority to do so. So this is very different from when I first arrived, even when I first started the company 20 years ago. Corporate is going to make it impossible to succeed. So the bigger the company, the harder it's going to be. Now, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of entrepreneurship, look, right now, if I was 25 right now, I would be here in a heartbeat. I'd be looking for opportunities. I would be, working for somebody, maybe at a bar or something, just networking, doing everything else. Because there's a ton of areas that you can look to and say, hey, I want to jump in and do my own little business and grow it from there. When you look, however, at the issue of manufacturing, it is quite clear that those opportunities have dwindled significantly. China not only has sort of superseded those that came before, but have built out their own new industries. So that'll be much more of a challenge. But I think on the servicing side of things, definitely a ton of opportunity.
I hear that for the local Chinese, it sometimes can be a bit daunting, right? To compete. There's this whole movement about Tangping, coasting and taking it easy because there's no point anyway. It's too hard. Do you think that it's just a temporary phenomenon, or you think how do you see that playing out for the locals?
I don't have an answer. I have an understanding of why we've gotten to this point. I mean, again, it's been 5 years from the moment COVID landed to where we are now. It's been 5 years, and it's been a rough 5 years. So, let's say you were 16, 17, 18, you're now in your early 20s. It's one of these, like, why bother? I don't know how this plays out. I do know that it's not endemic, meaning that it's like everybody's like this. You have a lot of people that are still, working hard. I've got, 10, 15 local Chinese here, and they're hardworking people. They're great. But I think that there is we don't want what our parents had with the 996, right? Work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, whatever the case might be. So there's been a societal shift for sure. But a lot of it is driven by the belief at the moment that there aren't the opportunities that they thought they would be able to get. Do I think it'll change? Yeah, I think it will. You get a little bit of animal spirits here, and things change pretty quickly. But again, I'm not certain about that at all.
Interesting.
What you made it into China pretty easily, it seemed. What was the immigration process? That's just a question because I happen to know a lot about the American one, and there's
Mhm.
all this rhetoric about we got to stem illegal immigration, but it's incredibly difficult to immigrate to the US legally. I mean, I've done it as a student, but it sucks. And I actually have now sponsored someone's work visa in the US as a business owner, which is kind of cool to be on the other side of it. But that process also sucks.
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so I understand anybody who wants to go to the US. I don't condone it. I think you should go the legal route, but there really aren't many avenues to do it. If you just want to go, say you have a job offer and you want to go and work, incredibly difficult. In Europe, much easier. I have no idea what it's like in China. Jason tells me a little bit about how it works in Singapore, but how is that?
It's not overly burdensome. I mean, I've got one, two, three, four, I have 5 guys that work for me that are foreigner. And you know, the requirements are, you got to have a diploma, you got to have an undergrad degree, a couple of years of experience, some other bits and pieces here. And then you get, a work permit and a visa, a work visa. So, and again, there's been a process over time where, I mean, I can tell you one thing, there was a period of time, again, going back to sort of the not really seeing how unstable things were back in 2012, where you had a ton of people that would go to Hong Kong and they would get what would be called an F visa, which is a business visa. But it was a multiple entry 6-month visa, meaning you could come and go as you like. They would come up here, they would hang out, they would work and, start some of their own companies, so on and so forth. That's been cracked down on. I'm super fortunate. I've got like a 5-year work visa, just expires. I renew it. People always say, "Oh, why don't you go and get the Chinese green card?" I'm like, no, no, no. I'm not doing that. As long as I can continue to work in China, I'm fine. But no, it's pretty nice, pretty easy. And again, what I find fascinating right now is I feel that right now is very similar to the period that I showed up in 1995, 96. Because back then, nobody cared about China. Nobody. And there were like a ton of opportunities, small community. I mean, the foreigners have all but, left. I mean, they've started to come back. Like Jason, you would have seen some in Xintiandi where we were, but that's like the center of nightlife in China, in Shanghai.
Yeah.
But there's just a lot. There's a lot of opportunity if you're looking and willing to take some risk to come and sort of work in China.
Oh, they had left in the aftermath of COVID or during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So,
interesting.
Peter, you said for a 25-year-old, what about someone like my age or Lovis's age, around 40? Would that also be something to think about? Because I feel like it is as well still, but I might be mistaken and looking at it through rose-colored glasses, right?
That's a little bit more difficult because it really depends on the individual and their situation in life. Whether, they've got a mortgage or they've got kids. I mean, it's what going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. It was just like, it was great when I was 25. And, if I failed when I came to China, I'd just come back to New York and, pick up where I left off. So I think you have to look at what it is you're looking to achieve, what your, framework might be. There's always going to be risk involved no matter what. You don't know if anything's going to work out. And, what's the great American saying? Like, how comfortable are you in being uncomfortable? So it depends on the opportunity set, what you're looking to do, you name it. But yeah, I would say there are definitely opportunities for people that are experienced in a specific industry. Sure.
Yeah, that's good to know.
What about, since we're kind of on this vein, like how burdensome is doing your taxes in China?
Not really. I have to, full disclosure, I have a finance manager who just, you pay a monthly income tax. It's progressive. It's kind of like the United States. And at the end of the year, they're like, hey, do you have any other sources of income? And you kind of write it down. Self-disclosure to a certain extent. And then you just sign it and hand it in. It's if you're either working for or running a company, a lot of those sorts of things get dealt with through the HR and finance departments.
It's just as a private citizen in Germany, it probably takes me 2 weeks, I would say. Like, so what, 80 hours of work every year, like no joke, to do my taxes. And then I still get letters. Like I just got one from like 2020, right? I traded some stocks during COVID, or some options. I was betting on the S&P to go down and made some, not much. I made a little bit of money. And Jason got me into it actually. And then they're like, "Hey, looks like you've had all this trade revenue in the UK in 2020, and you never declared it." And then in this one letter, right, it says like basically at this point, if you self-disclose that you evaded taxes, that'll be your best outcome legally speaking. You'll still get punished, but it'll be like this is the first time I'm here. And then it was like I called them. And I'm like, "What is this about?" And they're like, "Well, it says here you had an interactive brokers account." I'm like, "Well, duh." But I didn't, like, I declared my profits. They're like, "Well, yeah, but that was way less than what we see here in our data." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's not my fault." Like trade, like if you guys don't understand the difference between trade volume and profits, that's not, and
Yeah.
anyway, like the level of like freaking scrutiny that you receive in Germany is so mind-blowing, and then also at the same time mixed with some level of incompetence. And I had at least a sleepless night because of this letter. I'm like, "Oh my god, what do I do? I'm basically thought I was going to prison, right?" And then turns out it's nothing. Like, luckily, right, knock on wood, it's nothing.
Yeah.
But so I'm always I'm frankly scared to, and this is also a big reason why I want to leave Germany, in the sense, at least, I mean, don't have to physically leave it. I like being here, but I don't want to be a tax resident anymore, because I feel like being an international entrepreneur type in Germany, I want to get in trouble inadvertently, violating some rule that I'm unaware of, and then end up in a heap of trouble. And I just don't want to, right? Because I pay all my taxes. I'm very diligent, but it still doesn't seem to be enough, right? And that's the problem. That's the thing that's making me mad. Is like, I'm literally doing what I can, and it's still, there's always something, always a little brown letter in the mail on some recycled paper from the government saying, "Oh, but did you do this?" And I'm like, I don't know, like it feels impossible to navigate it correctly. So I'm saying all this because this speaks a lot to me about what it means to be able to live a free life, and being kind of obviously respectful of the rules the government puts up, but at the same time having a feeling of being also unencumbered, right? I want to feel like my government is in my corner helping me succeed, and not milking me permanently like a cow, if that makes sense.
Can I offer you some unsolicited advice?
Please.
Move to Hong Kong and set your company up there.
There you go.
I mean, if you've already got, I mean, it'll be miserable for you to fly if you're having to go to Texas all the time, no doubt. But I mean, I can tell you that, the company that I run is incorporated in Hong Kong. And then we have a subsidiary up here, which is sort of the operating business. It's pretty straightforward stuff. But Hong Kong, if you're there and you're making money, sure, flat tax of 15% or whatever it is, but there's no tax on capital gains. I think dividends maybe get taxed. I can't recall, but it's very, very straightforward. It's a challenge to get permanent residency there. But I do believe that if you're in Germany and you're working in another jurisdiction, you don't have to pay German taxes, correct?
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah. While I maintain a residence here, I'm eligible to pay. But luckily, as a German leaving Germany, then you don't have to pay. If you're American, it's a little different, right? You have
Yes.
lifelong right and obligation. Actually, why don't you want the Chinese green card? Does it come with strings attached, or how does that work?
No, there's no strings attached, but I don't know. My allegiance is to I feel like I should put it in my hand. It's like my allegiance is to the United States of America.
Okay.
One of the reasons I mentioned, I think, to you guys that I'm glad to be able to have this opportunity to talk to you is, for the longest time, I just kept a very low profile. I talked to clients, that was it. Didn't want to get involved, didn't want to talk publicly about a lot of these things. And then I realized it's my civic duty. I'm very blessed to be in a situation right now where I run my own company, money's not an issue. I've got no real nothing really tying me down. A beautiful wife, but kids that are up and out of the, doing their own thing. So, um, part of me is like, I'm an American. I'm not a Chinese green card holder. Like, I'm not going to do that. And there's no real benefit other than I can come and stay wherever I want. I don't have to get a visa, but no, it's more of a statement for myself.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, people ask me all the time if I want to get a U.S. passport. Like for most Americans are like, "Oh, so you married an American, so you're going to get a U.S. citizenship." And I'm like, I probably could at some point, but I have no interest in it. I like being German, as long as I can come and go and do what I want to do. There's not really
Yeah.
any reason to renounce my citizenship or anything like that.
That's so interesting. So same for me, right? Like people have asked me that question and I always just brushed it off. They're like, "Oh, do you want to get an EU passport?" I'm happy with the Singaporean one.
Right.
Yeah.
One of
Singapore's
the
pretty
best
good.
passports in the world.
Yeah, and also it is a statement, right? It is about who you are and allegiance. Yeah, I love living here, but no matter what happens, I'm not European, right? I'm always gonna be a happy visitor that is glad for the hospitality, but I'm not from here, right? And
And
yeah, for me,
that is what every single day I know. I am a guest in this country. I'm very fortunate to be a guest in this country. And that could change tomorrow. So again, rules of engagement, like just knowing what's going on, knowing your place. So yeah, Jason, I hear that.
Peter, last question because we're running pretty long already. But so
Yeah.
we've touched on it a little bit, right? With do you still see opportunity? But now asking about you personally, what is your long-term vision, I guess, from here on out? Like, what do you have any goals you're hoping to achieve personally, professionally, or what's next for you? You think?
I get asked that a lot. I don't have an answer. Oddly enough, I kind of joke and say that having lived here for so long sort of makes it difficult to really plan. But I've also been very, very, very blessed. Again, that if you look at what you're supposed to achieve, let's say in a life as a man, I've checked all the boxes, right? Great kids, married, second wife, but still married. She's awesome. Very good for me too. Started my own company. I have the respect of an industry, all these sorts of things. So you sit there and go, well, what's next? I don't know. Again, like I said, civic duty. I'm trying to have conversations with more people to say,
Mhm.
look, let's talk through things. Let's have a better understanding. And quite frankly, I do believe that because I've got nothing to lose, which sounds really strange. Like we talked just before about taxes. I have nothing in the United States. I think I have a bank account. That's about it. No property, no 401k, like no liabilities whatsoever. No debt, no nothing. And it is really to the point of freedom. It is very, very liberating. Because my personality is one where I've been fired, something I didn't discuss. I've been fired 3 times before I started my own company because I felt so committed to a certain point of view that these were all big Fortune 500 companies. So I know that there's a degree of having to be able to have that level of character to say what needs to be said. And I realize that when you look around, I understand why people, they have career risk and they have all these different elements. They have to be more contrite and circumvent and whatever needs to be done, whereas I don't. So I don't really know where this amazing ride is going to go. I'm just going to continue to get up and ride it every day. It's a ton of fun, and see where things head. I don't know. I'll get another 5 or 6 years, mid-50s right now. We'll see where things where things go by the time I turn 60. 60 sounds old.
Yeah, they keep raising retirement age. It's not that old.
Especially in China.
I am what is referred. I am what is referred to as Gen X in the United States, and even at a very young age, early 20s, we all knew there was no way we were getting any retirement from our government.
No way. Yeah, right. I don't plan on getting any.
Hmm.
How can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you or your advisory?
And also, Peter, tell us a little bit about Z-Ben or Z-Ben. How do you pronounce it? Like, what do you do? Like,
How do you think it should be pronounced?
I would pronounce it Z.
Only Americans say Z.
Yeah, but
Everybody
you're
else says
American.
but again, I've lived outside of the country for 30 years. No, it's pronounced Zeben, and it's a play on capital markets, meaning capital,
Ziban,
which
is
is
it?
Zeben, Shishang, right? Zeben.
Okay.
But it's same pronunciation, two different characters. For Zeben meaning fast, reliable analysis. It's a very niche business that we run. We work with global financial groups that are either in China, looking to expand in China, looking to enter China, and want to make sure that they are, they know kind of what's going on. We do research. I'm on these types of calls all the time. A client of mine, I think, accurately pinpointed the value proposition of what we do, which is we are organizational insurance on China, meaning when something hits a headline, I will get an email from somebody saying, I need you to get on a conference call to talk to our people here or people there, just to give them, what's really going on. If you just type in z-ben.com, you'll find our website there. If you're interested, most of the engagement I do is on LinkedIn. Type in Peter Alexander, z-ben.com. You'll see me pop up, and my unfiltered, unconventional opinions on a once, twice, 3 times a week, something like that.
Yeah, ever since I found you, I've started to go on LinkedIn more often.
Yeah, it's a legacy issue for me. Like I never cared for Twitter. Was never really into social media. Always had sort of LinkedIn as business, and that's, like I said, it's my own kind of therapy session to be able to just spew out what I'm thinking when something comes up that is a bit triggering.
I highly appreciate having you on my LinkedIn feed now, because I think LinkedIn is like one of the worst in terms of conformity. I think everybody's just, there's so much CYA going on when people post on LinkedIn. That's why most content, I think, is so incredibly boring there, because it's like, oh my god, this is all just regurgitated gibberish. But your commentary, I think, is very refreshing, very insightful. So thank you for
Much
that.
appreciated.
Cool. Thank you so much, Peter. We'll wrap it up here.
All right. My pleasure, guys. I appreciate you reaching out and asking me to come on. This was a lot of fun.